LAK to solve problems around equity and race, gender, identity, the systematic inequalities that we all probably care about when we sit at the dinner table and really think about it. We probably care about those problems, but the people in positions to really analyze this stuff, to use the tools, to use big data, to use statistical analysis, primarily are white men and folks from East Asia who have an entirely different social cultural environment that isn't necessarily reflective of the systematic tensions and limitations that have led to an unequal education system. And if everyone in the room is not in agreement on that, that's fine. But I hope you're not unaware of the disproportionate inequalities that occur in education today and how they are shaped by race and culture and class. So that being said, what does this look like? What does this shape itself by? What's out there? For my literature review of over a year of looking at different papers in different journals, talking to professors, talking to academics, talking to technologists, primarily folks in LAK seem to be focused on testing data, trying to predict things with MOOCs like motivation and distraction. And then, one of the things that I think is becoming more popular and being incorporated into policy is the idea of risk score analysis and predicting students who might be at risk. I can get into that in more detail later, but, just looking at that as a whole, that seems to be the entire space for the most part. And when I think about the purpose of LAK so far, from my analysis, it's primarily folks who are trying to get their papers put into journals that raise their status, or to find ways to monetize their algorithms and research. And if people disagree with that, I'm not saying there aren't folks out there that write papers on race and gender and equity. I'm saying that those aren't the papers that come up when you do research primarily. So that in mind, we also have to talk about the ethics and the kind of moral grounding of LAK right now, which also seems to just primarily focus on issues of privacy and data ownership and data governance, which are all highly important, but don't seem to tackle this issue of equity and inclusion. And so that's kind of the state as I see it now. And like I said, that's based off my research. And as I've gone through this journey, I've spoken to the kind of outliers in this space who do touch on issues of race, gender, and other issues of equity, whether it be, immigrant education, protecting dreamers, and using data to kind of prevent the violation of those folks' rights. Like, those conversations are much more in the periphery, while the conversations about monetization, algorithms, and using them to predict risk scores and academic outcomes are kind of the primary focus. And it is my opinion that, learning analytics has the potential to be more than just how do we get kids to get good grades on SATs and how do we get kids into college. It can be a resource to help reform the way we look at education, become more agile, and serve all communities in a specific way. So that's not necessarily the primary focus of this chat, but that's how I see the state of LAK in my research and in my experience. What I want to move on to is what this thing is kind of more focusing on, which is how do we get talent from different backgrounds and different experiences into the classroom and into these programs. So basically tackling the problem of attracting talent. I know for me, I've always thought of myself as someone who likes to walk into things head first, but I know a lot of folks, particularly folks who are more interested in math and STEM fields, and who are, primarily people of color. And I'm going to speak from that lens from here on out, even though I'm using that as a proxy for quote unquote diversity. I'm only going to speak to the folks that I have a lot of interaction with, which is primarily men and women of color. Not everyone wants to be a pioneer. Not everyone wants to be the only Black person or the only woman in the classroom. And I think that expectation is quietly put on people to just always be the only or the first. And if you want to attract people from diverse backgrounds, you have to make the room feel more inviting from the beginning. So when I look at programs like the one at ASU and the one where I come from at Teachers College, even when I go to the website, I mean, it doesn't feel as though this is a program where I'm going to see people who look like me, who think similar to me, who have the same concerns as me. And I think that will go a long way to shaping like what people click yes on when they think about going into grad school programs for 1 or 2 years. I was talking to Charles about this the other day, going back to the issue around how the field is primarily dominated by white men from, STEM backgrounds and, econ backgrounds and econometrics backgrounds, and how this kind of basically leads to implicit bias and confirmation bias challenges, meaning folks from similar backgrounds write papers on things that they find interesting. They go to their colleague, their colleague says, actually, I think that's interesting too. And then they codify their opinions into best practices. Those opinions and best practices become what shapes journals, what shapes lectures, and then also starts to shape research agendas. And then from there, what I've seen is once those agendas are shaped, this determines what gets funded, and this determines who gets money for labs and who gets money to give scholarships to which scholars. And it's not that any of this is malicious. I don't actually think any of this is malicious. I just think that there's a huge blind spot at the administrative and institutional level of how we use our resources and the messaging we put out there when we say we want to attract diverse talent, we want to attract diverse voices, but we keep pouring resources into the same channels that have either proven to be quote unquote successful or at least stable. And what I'm getting at here is just this idea of the status quo being good enough and just saying lip service to the idea of diversity. So when you have these challenges of implicit bias and confirmation, and that shapes who gets money, who gets scholarships, and what the programs look like, you're gonna have an inclusion gap. Primarily because just like everyone in this room and myself, sure, when we're looking at programs, we're looking for cost, we're looking at location, we're looking at flexibility, and we're looking at length of program, and most importantly, we're looking at return on investment. But at the same time, I think there's a different concern for people of color, women, those who don't see themselves in those programs. The concern is, will I grow? Will I find mentorship? Will I find someone who takes my ideas seriously and not just as a, oh, that's interesting, you should follow that. I think a number of times in my experience from undergrad to grad school in this space, there have been a lot of folks who say things like, that's interesting, but not, well, what are you gonna do next about it? And even just having a professor or an advisor who takes that level of interest can help a student feel more included in these programs. Whereas when I'm looking at research papers that explore almost the same 3 or 4 subjects, and I don't see people who look like me or are interested in what I'm interested in, it's just discouraging. The same rules apply to K-12 that apply to grad school. People want to feel like they're included. People want to feel like their ideas are being seen as valuable, even if they're just an idea. And so those are the things that I think are the challenges, especially when like I said before, the idea of finding mentorship and finding a place to feel included. Those are the things that I think that disproportionately, and particularly women and people of color, not just in LAC, but in all STEM fields, have felt kind of ostracized from those experiences. I mean, look at Harvard's math department. They've never had a woman faculty member, I believe. I mean, that's kind of absurd. And I've talked to brilliant professors who are at different institutions who have said, yeah, I don't want to be part of this boys club, so I'm going to go to a different place or not, pursue this opportunity. That same mentality isn't unique to someone who has worked their whole life to get to this position, to get tenure. It applies to the grad student at age 25 who's just trying to figure out how to get a distribution curve to work. Like, you're trying to learn the basics of the field while also trying to see if your ideas are even relevant. And if you don't have the support to see that, then, I mean, when is it going to happen? So that's the bad news. I think I've laid out a lot of bad news. I see some frowns, and that's okay. I wasn't here to make everyone feel good, because it doesn't feel good for me and people like myself who feel like they're alone in these spaces. Now, here's the good news. There are a lot of not easy fixes, but they're obvious fixes. And the first thing I think about is what I mentioned before, seeing someone who looks like you in these programs, seeing someone who identifies with the things you care about. That one is a problem that is the biggest issue, and it doesn't solve itself. It's kind of like I'm going a roundabout way to getting to solving that problem, which is number 2, you got to start pushing your programs wherever you are. I don't know if you're in institutions of learning or if you're leaving those institutions of learning or if you're a faculty member yourself, but you have to start pushing for scholarship that specifically calls out and addresses the structural inequalities that exist in your programs. Meaning, why are all the tenure professors in this program or the adjunct professors in this program white men from 2 or 3 universities? Why are there no scholarships for students of color who live in the city or in the town? Why is no one from the neighborhoods that we're exploring actually in our programs? Why are there no one who looks like the people, the data points, quote unquote, that we're trying to analyze in these programs? And that's where scholarship becomes important. That's where marketing becomes important. You can put together a great brochure, but if your brochure doesn't have a section that says, we provide scholarship that specifically addresses the systemic inequalities that exist around race, gender, and et cetera, then personally, I'm just gonna be like, oh, you're just another university trying to get my $80,000 in student loans to pay for your program. I wanna feel like that my university and my institution actually cares about the problems that we're trying to address and aren't just giving lip service to them. The third thing I think about is if you don't have the resources, because grad schools are constantly losing money or constantly like shrinking in their budget, you can still celebrate the research that exists out there, even if it's not from your institution, of scholars of color, women scholars in this space. You can still give them a platform and say, whether it's your Twitter, whether it's your website, whether it's journals, you can do this work and put it out there and put it as a public space so that people see themselves in the work. It's not that hard to take a paper written by someone who is maybe approaching a challenge about the inclusion gap in gender when it comes to STEM programs in K-12 and analyzing that on the level of a district. Like there was a research I found about from Harvard Government School that worked with Wake County, North Carolina, and they analyzed, they used an algorithm in a learning management system to basically place students of color in geometry so that they would be at the appropriate math level by 9th grade, working with middle school kids. And it was specifically targeting 7th and 8th graders of color and how they saw a 30% increase in probability of those students passing geometry at grade level by 9th grade. Like, that research is free. You can just put that out there and show, like, we're trying to do things like this. The point being is you don't necessarily have to be a person who identifies as a minority or is underrepresented, but you and everyone in this room can look for research that targets those spaces and highlight that as part of your programs. Call out those research papers, call out those journals and those articles. And then the fourth thing is, if you don't want to like look for brand new research because maybe you don't like the primary researcher or you don't trust the journal or it's not relevant to what your program is focusing on for this year, you can still highlight people throughout history who have been a part of this world. My favorite example, and he's my idol, is W.E.B. Du Bois. He's known in America as a civil rights activist, education advocate, and philosopher, and he coined the phrase double consciousness. But he also is one of our great data visualizers of the 20th century. I mean, you can look up his work in the Library of Congress about how he was one of the first people to gather data on African Americans during and post-slavery, on how they become employed, where they put their money, how they pay their taxes, where does it go. All this was done by him and his team. And all the data visualizations are obviously done by hand, and they're gorgeous pieces of artwork that really, I have one hanging in my bedroom because it inspires me to remind me that there were people who looked like me who did this work before. And maybe that gets taken for granted when predominantly white Americans see themselves in history and in the present all the time. But for people of color, and I can't speak for women because I'm not a woman, but I've spoken to other women who feel the same way, that when you don't see yourself in history, you don't see the history as possible for you. Like, if you don't see folks who have done it before you, you think that you have to be the first and the only, and that is not something that should be everyone's responsibility. So these are the three things I mentioned, number 2 through 4, which is that's not free. The celebration of current research and the celebration of historical research, that's free. That doesn't require a university to get a donor to do anything. It doesn't require them to move funds around. It just requires them to care, and beyond just putting a sentence on a website. So as far as addressing the challenge of talent and attracting talent, those are the things that would change my mind. Those are the things that make me want to go, oh, like, they're down. They understand. I'm not going to say they're woke because we don't need to be saying that anymore. It's just tired. It's played. But the point is, these are people who are putting their mission where their mouth is. So they claim they care about inclusion and diversity. Well, where is it? And it can't just be like a couple of Getty images that you found that show your one African-American student sitting next to your one woman student and they're looking at a computer. It has to be like, if you want people who care about data analysis, care about this LAK research, who are probably highly analytical people, regardless if they have a math background, they have an analytical mindset, they're going to do their homework. They're not just going to take that first page and run with it. They're going to dig into the available resources. And if they see that your efforts of inclusion and diversity stop at that one image, then they're going to move on, or they're just going to be discouraged. So, I mean, those are the things when it comes to tackling the talent problem that I think are really important. I think when we think about like now getting people in the door is one thing. I think retention is another one. And I'm not just speaking on this from a learning analytics background. This is coming from my corporate consulting background around talent retention and including people of color and retaining talent of diverse backgrounds, whether it's people of color, women, veterans, like I said, immigrant students. Retention is a whole nother game. You can get people in the door, but keeping them there is a totally different space. As far as the technical skill stuff, like I'm not here to tell tell people if they should be focusing on R, Python, or MATLAB, or any of these things. But retention isn't necessarily about technical skills as much as about creating an environment where people feel like their ideas are going to be heard. They feel like there's a platform for them to speak. And there's also room for them to not have to speak, to not be the only person who represents an entire group of people in a room. Because not everyone wants to say anything. I know in learning analytics, folks can be sometimes more introverted than extroverted. Well, that is also happening from a culture to culture background. And so being the only person of color, the only woman in the room, to have to see something in the data that talks specifically to your interest as a researcher who focuses on race or gender or other aspects of diversity shouldn't just be your responsibility. So creating that classroom where everyone in the room feels like they have something to contribute when it comes with respect to these different areas of diversity is kind of what I think is key to talent retention. So what does that look like? This is what I had a lot more fun with, and this is probably biased by my liberal arts background. For me, I made it imperative in my program at TC because it was very flexible to take courses that were outside of my domain. I took a philosophy of education course, and I think that even though most folks in this space are going to either be working at the policy level or working at an NGO or a think tank or some kind of ed startup, I think it's important for people who care about education and education equity and inclusion to have a philosophy of education. It's literally one semester course. So, I mean, that's something that we can get done just by being more curious when you're exploring courses. Another thing I think is super important, and my computer might die, and that's on me. Another thing to consider is I think, first and foremost, I consider myself a storyteller and not a scientist or I'm not solving problems, but I'm illuminating issues that exist and using data to do that work. And I think that can only happen when you step away from the idea of just looking at data as generalized and you become a domain specialist. So I think when we're thinking about inclusion and trying to create activities and work that are specific to making folks feel part of the conversation, you have to yourself know why you're doing this. And I think any great researcher, any great scientist, or any great person who wants to work towards education equity has to know what story they want to tell. If your story is about, for me, for instance, is addressing the structural inequalities that exist due to racial injustice in education and outside of education, that helps you specify what type of data you're going to be looking at. I primarily look at K-12 education data, and I look at local jail data and arrest data, because these are the spaces that I see the data telling the greatest stories to what I care about, which is how do we prevent kids from going into the school to prison pipeline, and then how do we also highlight the deficit perspectives that exist in schools that say things like 45% of African American boys need to be in special ed classes. Well, is that what the data is saying, or is that the narrative that we've already decided is the case? And so me as a storyteller, I'm interested in counter narrative around that and using data to tell those counter narratives. And not just because I have a perspective on this because I'm a Black man, but because I think this is another part that I think is super important. I think if you're going to be in learning analytics, you still have to have some background in the classroom. Like, you have to spend time with teachers, you have to spend time with students, whether it's volunteer or you're getting paid, if you don't spend time with the data subjects that you analyze on a daily basis, like how do you see them as human? How do you see them as people? How do you see them as things that go beyond cell A1? And I think like being able to have that perspective and see like a column that says something like, I don't know, top achievers, and know that that is literally collapsing an entire person into one cell, that you know from your experience with that person, they're way more complicated than that, helps you analyze the data and have the nuance necessary to not only analyze it, but tell a better story that questions the status quo, tell a specific story that is targeting a specific audience that has limited time. If you work in schools or if you work at the DOE or some larger structure, you know that the people that you report to have 5 minutes at best to listen to your data, listen to what you have to say about the data. So how do you do that? Well, you have to become a storyteller that tells a specific story, and that story has to be rooted in your analysis, but it also has to be able to feel human. And so I attempt to address specific questions. I attempt to offer specific insights to a very specific audience. And I don't pretend to know more than that specific knowledge group, because I don't. And I think that our tools and data analytics allow us to have access to so much data, so much noise. And it's up to us to cut through that noise and tell the specific story that solves a specific challenge in education. And when it comes to this idea of inclusion and equity, that's paramount. So this doesn't have to do with your race. This doesn't have to do with your identity. It has to do with the lens that you look through information and what story you're trying to tell. So that to me is like what I think about when it comes to retention. Everyone's living truth and living in their story while analyzing this data. Then it's easier to have more robust conversations, not conversations where we're all just in our heads and everything, but having conversations where we are able to say, that's interesting because I see this in the data, well, I see this data. And then we start to have a more robust looking at these students, these teachers, for the folks that we're trying to serve. And then finally, yeah, I mean, after all that kind of flow of consciousness, I think for me, at this point, to be able to say this and confident is only because of certain folks certain practices that I engaged in. Like I said before, taking an ed loss course was paramount to me, understanding why I care about this work and being able to articulate it to myself. The second thing is I volunteer and work at schools and in school or inside jails. You don't have to do that. I did that because I particularly care about incarceration and juvenile incarceration data. So I'm going to care about the data. I need to care about the people that produce the data. So I think those are two things that are paramount. Have some kind of moral compass for why you care about particular types of data you explore, and having a relationship to the data, having a relationship to the people who produce the data. And really easy to volunteer with our background. You want people who know you do not tell you like all these things. So that's it. That's what I got.
Sorry.
Thank you for your time. I'll let you guys. It's been a great opportunity. Thank you, Charles. And
you can't. Can you hear? You can't. Hello?
Yeah, done. Yeah.
You're done. Oh.
Done.
Oh.
Done? Oh.
No, I wasn't cutting you off because you needed to be done time-wise.
Okay.
You were breaking up. Your audio.
Your audio was dipping in and out.
Yeah. Your last minute.
Oh, sorry. I'm done. Do I need just sign out, say bye?
No, your audio has been going in and out a bit, so
Okay.
only a little bit.
Only the last minute.
Okay. Oh, last minute. Volunteer with schools or at institutions that need analysis for free. And
sorry, it's breaking up really badly. Sorry, Rob.
It's okay.
We might just. Is that okay? The audio is kind of bad. So,
Okay.
you want to say bye? If we have any questions, we might send them to you. Is that okay?
Yeah, send me questions. Give them my email, and I'll answers.
Okay.
Thank you.